All right, let's dive into a single idea that, honestly, turned the world upside down. It's a doctrine that's been a source of incredible comfort for millions, but also some really fierce debate. We're talking about sola fide, or faith alone. And it all boils down to one huge personal question.
I mean, really think about that. How can any of us, flawed as we are, possibly hope to stand before a God who is perfectly holy and just? This isn't just some abstract theological puzzle. It's about the most personal question you could ever ask.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll get clear on what the doctrine actually is. Then we'll dig into the biblical case for it. After that, we're going to face the biggest objections head on. And finally, we'll see why this whole thing is meant to bring this deep, personal sense of assurance.
Okay, let's start with the basics. We got to define our terms. Because the idea of faith alone doesn't just come out of nowhere. It really stands on two massive pillars that were at the very center of the Protestant Reformation.
First up is the big one, sola fide. It's Latin, and it just means faith alone. Now, the most important word on this slide is instrument. The idea isn't that our faith itself makes us righteous. No way. Instead, faith is like an empty, open hand that simply receives the perfect righteousness that God gives to us as a gift. It's not something we do, it's how we accept what's been done for us.
So you might be asking, where did they even get this idea? Well, that leads us to the second pillar, sola scriptura, or scripture alone. This is the belief that the Bible is the final, ultimate authority on all of this stuff. So for the Reformers, salvation by faith alone wasn't just a clever theory. They were convinced it was what the Bible itself clearly taught.
Okay, so with those definitions in our back pocket, let's really build the case for sola fide. Why were its defenders so passionate that you absolutely cannot add your own good deeds into the salvation equation? Well, the argument really starts with the nature of God himself.
It all begins with this idea that God is completely self-sufficient. He doesn't need anything from us. And because of that, we, in our broken human state, just can't contribute anything to our own salvation. It means God has to do it all, from start to finish. So if salvation is a free gift, what the Bible calls grace, then it can't also be a wage we earn by working for it. It's either one or the other. You can't have it both ways.
Now, you've probably heard this phrase before. It's famous. It's trying to connect faith with good works. But some people argue it sets up a kind of logical trap. If you say you're saved by faith, but then you immediately say you need works to prove you have that faith, well, haven't you just made works a requirement for salvation all over again? It kind of feels like salvation by works just sneaking in through the back door.
This slide nails the distinction that the Bible makes, especially in the book of Romans. On the left, you see that work gets you wages. It's a transaction. You earned it. But on the right, faith leads to a gift. Righteousness isn't a paycheck you get for a job well done. It's something credited to your account, totally free out of sheer grace.
Of course, an idea this big has faced some serious pushback over the years. And to really get it, you have to look at those criticisms square in the face. So let's do that.
One of the biggest critiques, coming from thinkers like Alasdair MacIntyre, is that this whole faith alone thing promotes a kind of radical, selfish individualism. The fear is that if my salvation is just a private deal between me and God, then what about my community? What about my responsibility to other people? Does it just strip all that away?
But defenders of sola fide would say that this critique is confusing two totally different things, the how of our salvation versus the life of a saved person. The alone in faith alone is there for one reason, to get rid of human boasting. To make it crystal clear, we don't earn our way in. But, they argue, a person who has genuine faith, that faith will absolutely, inevitably change their life. It will produce good works and a love for others, not to get saved, but because they are saved. It comes from gratitude, not obligation.
And here's a related objection from theologians like Jürgen Moltmann. The worry is that sola fide basically cuts the cord between faith and morality. I mean, if my good works have zero effect on my standing with God, then why bother doing them? Doesn't this just become a license to live however you want?
The classic response to this is to think of a tree. Justification, being made right with God, is the root. That happens by faith and faith alone. Good works don't help the root grow, but a healthy, living root will always produce fruit. Good works are that fruit. So while your works don't save you, their presence is the evidence that you're saved. They're two different things, but you can't have one without the other.
And all of this brings us to our final and maybe the most important point.
why sola fide isn't just some abstract doctrine. For those who believe it, it is the only possible source of real, lasting spiritual comfort and assurance.
As the theologian Thomas Schreiner says, this whole debate is about the ultimate question. How in the world are we going to stand before God on Judgment Day? This is where all the theology gets incredibly personal, really fast.
I mean, just think about it. If your salvation depends, even just a tiny bit, on how well you perform, could you ever really be sure? Could you ever have peace? The standard is perfection. You'd be living in this constant state of anxiety, always wondering, did I do enough? Was I good enough today? What about yesterday? It's exhausting.
And that leads to the knockout punch for this doctrine supporters. True, unshakable assurance is only possible when your right standing with God depends 100% on His work and 0% on yours. Your confidence isn't found by looking inside at all your failures, but by looking outside of yourself, to the perfect righteousness of Christ that's been given to you.
And the result of this is supposed to be total liberation. It frees you from that constant fear and worry. It stops you from endlessly picking apart your own soul, and instead points you confidently toward Christ. All that energy you used to spend trying to prove yourself, you can now spend it on loving other people, not to get something, but just out of pure joy and gratitude.
Which leaves us with this final massive question. If it's true, if we are saved by faith alone, and our works don't add a single thing to it, then how are we supposed to live? The answer, according to this doctrine, is not a life of anxious rule-following, but a life of joyful, grateful, and radical love.